Dear students of Department of English, I am University Silchar. I have the pleasure to forward a lecture on Sujit Mukherjee and the notion of translation as transcreation, discovery, recovery, and new writing for the benefit of the students in the forthcoming semester examination. Together with K. Ayappa Panikar, A. K. Ramanujan, Sukanta Chaudhary, and P. Lal, Sujit Mukherjee has been unanimously acclaimed as one of the 10 best scholars on translation in India. As a professor of English in Pune University, Professor Mukherjee evinced keen interest in literary history, American studies, and Indian literature, and above all, he was an affirmed translator as well. Most of his essays are gathered and posthumously published in 2 seminal volumes under the titles Translation as Discovery, 1981, and Translation as Recovery in 2014. These 2 books bear true testimony to Mukherjee's wide-ranging information and depth of understanding regarding translation in the backdrop of the historical, social, and cultural nuances of India. As the titles of these 2 books suggest, translation is not only an art, but also, according to Mukherjee, a craft. Discovery, recovery, a kind of new writing, transcreation, and finally translation as a multilingual and multicultural discourse. To Mukherjee, translation not only discovers a new world, but also more predominantly recovers the original text in a renewed form. Hence, translation is a craft rather than a mere art. Translation is both discovery as well as recovery, both new writing as well as creative writing, both transcreation and a discourse executed in the backdrop of multilingualism and multiculturalism. As you know, Indian theory died down in 16th century after Vishwanath Kaviraja's Sahitya Darpan and Jagannatha's Rasa Gangadhara. And though all the theories of translation have developed prominently in the West, Indians were not lagging behind in the medieval period. And Mukherjee tries to establish the Indian mind and their art of translation as creative writing, which is the other name of new writing. It is called new writing or creative writing precisely because it interrogates the old notion that translation is mere rendering of source text into target text. Though Indians are not adequately equipped with the theories of translation like their Western counterpart, the Indians not lagging behind because since Hori passed, we have a lot of commentaries and translations of Vedas, Upanishads, and the 2 great grand epics of the world, that is the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And these renderings bear brilliant testimony to our originality and creativity, and hence translation has been treated in India as a new writing or creative writing. In this connection, Mukherjee, in his book Translation as Recovery, emphatically observes, I quote, "Until the advent of Western culture in India, we had always regarded translation as new writing." That translation was done in India in the medieval period is evident from the Uriya poet Sarala Dasa's translation of the Mahabharata into Uriya, Kasiram Dasa's Bengali translation of the two grand epics, Ramayana and Vishwanath Chaturama's Ramayana Kalpa, and all these things justify that translation activities were not lagging behind in the medieval period, though there was no systematic translation in India. So, in his introduction to discovery, Harish Dwivedi, another renowned professor of comparative literature and translation, observes how Mukherjee was able to offer, I quote, a most thoughtful, deeply engaged, closely attentive, widely contextualized, toughly interrogative, and highly readable account of a great variety of issues to do with translation in India, unquote. So, Trivedi has emphasized Mukherjee's adroit art of being a profound translator, because he not only knew how to go deeper into the source text, but also knew how to pay close attention to the renewed text, I mean the target text. As an university English teacher, Mukherjee combined the best of Indian and English sensibilities and expresses as a translator and a critic on translation his Indianness. This is the first important point we locate about Mukherjee's notion of translation. I repeat, in his translation, Mukherjee evinced his art of Indianness. I repeat, Indianness, and tends to explore the changes of the cultures and languages of India through an English-educated mind and sensibility. In this connection, Trivedi further opines that Mukherjee deeply rooted himself in Indian culture and developed an intellectual grace and rigor with which he negotiated the West in his own terms. Mukherjee's negotiation with the West can be testified from his powerful critical essays on translation and also through his creative use of the English language. As a result, neologisms abound and existing words are often given creative meanings in his translation. His contribution to translation studies in India can be satisfactorily situated in terms of post-colonial cultural consciousness and negotiation between East and West. Mukherjee is well aware of the complex multilingual situation of India, which necessitates the fact that translation cannot be separated from multilingual and multicultural mosaic of the country. A translator, according to Mukherjee, is then a cultural critic or a culture critic for whom translation is rewriting. I repeat, the second point, to Mukherjee, translation is rewriting, new writing, transcreation, recreation, discovery, and finally recovery. Here it may be noted that in his powerful book, Translation as Discovery, Mukherjee laments, I quote, "What we do not yet have in India is a theory or theories of translation," unquote. In the ancient classical and early medieval India, Sanskrit was the language of production of literary and religious texts, and subsequently their translation into other Indian languages since the later medieval period till today is a complex trajectory of cultural negotiation that contributed to the creation of a pan-Indian ethos. With the development of bhashas, I mean modern Indian languages, and their coexistence in a multilingual and multicultural Indian framework prompted their unavoidable negotiation for interaction, and such a situation obviously facilitated continuous processes of interlingual translation, which was or is a dire necessity for functional purposes in the present times. Here it may be noted that translation in India before colonization took two main forms. Number one, between the regional languages, it was performed mainly in oral for the practical, everyday interaction purposes. Number two, from the main language called Sanskrit into the bhashas. The translation took place for religious, literary, and educational purposes. All activities relating to translation before colonization were characterized by positive dynamism. I repeat, positive dynamism, vivacity, and creativity. And creativity was best traced in the history of written translation from Sanskrit. This is precisely because the purpose of translation in ancient and medieval times was totally different from what it is today. Most of the time, Sanskrit texts used to be changed in the form, what is called Rupantara, into several languages, what is called Bhashantara, and they were called Anuvada, meaning coming after or following after. In that case, the translators laid little emphasis on maintaining the originality of the source text. But contemporary translation tends to maintain proximity to the source text. This is very vital in the context of post-colonial translation in India. So translation cannot be separated from the source text. In other words, what distinguishes translation from its ancient counterpart today is fidelity to the source text. But ancients laid more emphasis on creativity in the target text and attitude or art which designates translation as transcreation. So transcreation is a method or art first used in India and then adopted globally by translation theorists, and thanks to the ancient creative reproduction of Sanskrit religious texts into regional languages for the benefit of the common man. And the best example is the translation of the Sanskrit Bhagavata Purana into different regional languages. Gradually, the practice of transcreation passed from religion to literary texts, and that is why Mukherjee calls translation new writing, whereas A.K. Ramanujan calls translation transposition, P. Lal calls translation transcreation, Mukherjee calls translation new writing. I repeat, to Mukherjee, translation is called new writing because it is revisited in such a way that it would reinforce the view of written translation as activity in India as highly dynamic and prolific. So these are two important qualities of translation, such as dynamism and prolific quality, which characterizes, according to Mukherjee, translation as new writing. The emphasis on creative potential, which is called in Sanskrit aesthetics pratibha or pragya, is another interesting feature of translation in India. In Sanskrit aesthetics, pratibha, which is translated as outstanding original genius, is described as, I quote, pratibha vastu nirmana kshama pragya. In translation, it can be like this: creative genius is a outstanding plot-making power. And this pratibha allows the translator to enjoy freedom from mere imitation, or what Aristotle says, mimesis. And this vivacity, creative originality in the translation processes in the colonial period tends Mukherjee to define translation as craft. So it is now justified that translation is not mere art, and according to Mukherjee, translation is both new writing, creative writing, as well as a craft. The word craft is used to entail all the creativity of translational processes. Mukherjee is more comfortable with the word craft rather than art and feels uneasy to accept the comment that translation is a secondary activity, or what others call oil painting. Mukherjee observes in his book Translation as Discovery, I quote, whereas in many perception underlined by some practice, translating a literary work stands very close and nearly equal to the writing of it, unquote. In other words, Mukherjee is of the firm opinion that translation is a creative activity, which is evident from the use of the word craft. He further states that translation stands very close to the original literary writing because it involves both creative and critical activity. In his 2 books and several articles written in this regard, he tends to vindicate the fact that translation is a creative activity. Till now, we have been acquainted with Mukherjee's support for translation as transcreation, creation or recreation rather than mere imitation, and translation as craft and new writing. In the essay under the title, The Craft, Not Solemn Art of Translation, accommodated in his book Translation as Recovery, Mukherjee further vindicates the notion of translation as craft rather than as art. While referring to the everyday practice of interlingual communication, usually done orally, most for the practical purpose, prefers to call translation a craft. Mukherjee states, I quote, to regard such a habit as art would be to claim an unwarranted distinction. That habit can be refined into a craft rather than exalted to an art. Unquote. Everyday functional translation shares in the creativity, originality, and spontaneity of written translation. It cannot be called an art, but it also entails the essence of craftsmanship. So this is very important. Mukherjee's third important point on translation is that translation is more a craft than an art. Now, with the advent of English, translation underwent several changes and in the context and the role of translation in India changed radically. With British colonization, the positive and creative atmosphere of translation activities carried out before the colonial days seem to have been shattered by colonial mindset that took control over the language and culture by hegemonizing the native culture. Translation scene changed significantly in 3 different aspects after British hegemony. They are, number 1, translation of Indian literary text into English. Number 2, translation of English literary text into other languages, translation from one Indian language into another Indian language. And Mukherjee observes that the trajectory of each kind of translation was different, but the total outcome was a tremendous enrichment of our literary culture. This is under quotation, tremendous enrichment of our literary culture. In that sense, Mukherjee tends to admit or concede that English language was a blessing on the one hand and perhaps an obstacle on the other because of the hegemonization. Indeed, changes were radical and rather political. For instance, the role of Sanskrit came to be progressively reduced and English occupied the center stage. This is the negative aspect of the British hegemony, and after having taken the center stage, English became the master language, the language of most translation processes later 19th century and later 19th century, which witnessed translation of Sanskrit texts into English and into other regional languages. For educational purposes, gradually English took over as a target language. English controlled the arena of translation. Translation of literary and scriptural texts was most frequently performed from the Indian languages into English. The translation of textbooks, manuals of different types, as well as scientific treatises were also done by Europeans and Indians. Both was commonly performed from English into the Indian languages, which was established as a regular practice in the second half of the 18th century. To be precise, Sanskrit played a predominant role before colonization, but after English took over the center stage, English belittled Sanskrit, and English language played a decisive role after the colonization of India, whereas Sanskrit was benevolent mother giving birth to new creations. English came to be a master, absorbing texts, ideas, and traditions. This is the delicate difference. Sanskrit was a benevolent mother of all Indian languages, and English came to exercise its hegemony as a master over Sanskrit, which was belittled perhaps to a captive. Translation into English were as interventionalists assuming power over Indian languages, language writers, Mukherjee aptly maintains that before colonization, Sanskrit was respected as mother and translators were transcreationists who did not exercise political superiority over the original authors. Thus, transcreationists, according to Mukherjee, gave way to masters. Creativity gave way to power exertion, and this is called political implications or ramifications of translation after the imposition of British hegemony. For instance, William Jones' translation of Shakuntala and translation of major literary works in Sanskrit and Old Tamil, Pali and Prakrit were translated into English. The translations in 18th and 19th century were mostly done by British scholars of Indology and a few American scholars. As a result, we have today a sizable quantity of Indian literature of every age in English translation, writing to be read and written about, reviewed and revised, studied and taught. English first conquered Indian languages, textual production also through mother tongue translators. Translation into English was increasingly practiced by Indians, a trend which brought about the most significant changes and opened to further developments such as the rise of IEL, Indian English literature. To be precise, the post-colonial translation landscape in India involves the following points. Number one, there was the constant decrease of written translations between the bhashas, Indian languages. Number two, the rise and development of a new craft, that of translating into India as a non-native language on the part of Indian translators. Number three, the occasionally manipulative essence of this new craft, translations from Indian languages into English seem to have a right to smooth out or change textual features to better go with the English version. Number four, the development of Indian English literature came as a sort of companion to translation from the Indian languages into English. These are the four important developments. You must remember, my dear students, in the context of the post-colonial translation, and this exercised tremendous influence on these stalwarts of translation in India in 20th century. These new trends and activities have accompanied India from the colonial days to the days of post-colonial era or decolonization. This development has both merit and demerit. As regards demerit, the increasingly dominating hegemonic role of English has jeopardized the production and dissemination of works into the Indian languages, and the use of English as the decidedly powerful medium of translation led to manipulation of Mukherjee. Says, I quote, "There is a regrettable tendency among translators into English of both foreign and native species to interfere with the original text in various ways while translating out of the earnest desire to improve upon the original. There is a measure of hegemony involved here. Even after more than half a century of conscious decolonization, the English language continues to hold such a position of authority in modern India that those who translate literary works into English somehow convince themselves that they are doing a favor to the Indian language writer by presenting him or her through translation to a wider world. In return for such service, some of our translators feel free to chop and change, omit or rearrange the original to their own satisfaction." Unquote. Here Mukherjee does not lament the hegemonic role acquired by English in India with reference to translation, but points out that the status and role of English have resulted in a generalized and manipulative attitude on the part of translators. This attitude would be seen as the reverse of the essence of transcreation, positive, constructive creativity, whose ultimate goal was the fully enjoyment of text by a variety of people. And this goal has turned into a political and ideological hegemony, which has led to manipulating Indian texts, smoothing out their features to streamline them with global English-driven tendencies. As regards the positive implications, translation into English has allowed a much wider dissemination of Indian texts and prompted many Indian writers to produce texts directly in English. And this is how our Indian writing English literature has developed prominently in the colonial and post-colonial period. Now, Mukherjee further pleads for respecting difference, and in that sense he is a postmodernist. The call of postmodernism and the post-colonialism is respected by him. For while translating into English from Indian languages, one has to strive to preserve and disseminate India's cultural, social and linguistic complexity. English is to be seen and used as an instrument in the hands of Indian translators rather than be allowed to smooth out diversity. Reflecting on his own translational activity, Mukherjee observes that English in his translations serves the specific purpose of enhancing dissemination of Bengali texts. In an interesting essay called Transcreating Translation, Mukherjee observes the positive effects of the use of English. Translation as a practice has become the very object of transcreation. The language of the colonizer lends itself to the growth of a new literary and cultural tradition born out of post-colonialism. English is no longer a foreign language in India. It now becomes and has belonged to Indians who are well capable of bending it to their own purposes. I quote, "The English language has got so domesticated that Indians not only translate Indian language texts into English, but they are also writing poetry, fiction and drama in English even when they have lived much of their lives in India." Unquote. Mukherjee draws a reference to P. Lal, who in 1970 tended to patronize translation as transcreation, which means translation is a creative translation, giving a new life to the text through target text. Translation in Lal's practice and Mukherjee's words becomes a tool for recovery, the recovery of texts written in India before and after colonization, and their recreation with a new life in English. And it is in that sense that Mukherjee's stand is vindicated, that translation is not only discovery but also recovery. Translators are no more perpetrators of submission to a dominant language and culture. They become active, creative agents in a process which can upturn asymmetries and redesign the ethics of difference through translation. Translation does not merely reflect knowledge, it creates knowledge. I repeat, a wonderful sentence. Translation does not merely reflect knowledge, but it creates knowledge. Underline the word creates knowledge. It is in that sense that translation is transcreation, translation is new writing, translation is creative writing. English today is no more a threat, but a tool for reinforcing asymmetry and for erasing cultural specificity. By virtue of its being one of India's official languages, English is seen as a creative tool in the hands of Indians. Language like translations are never fixed, and this is precisely what Mukherjee suggests in one of his most powerful statements about translation. I quote, "The translated work enjoys an enormous advantage over the original. The original tends to get fixed in form as soon as it becomes widely known." Unquote. Translation bestows an indefinitely long life upon a text whose original career may have terminated much earlier had it now drawn a translator's attention. The truly crafty translator will know why he translates, for whom he translates, what he should translate, and how much he should translate, and semi-finally, where to stop and where to begin. So a translator is a great craftsman. So translation is not a mere art. Translation is a craft, and a translator, an ideal translator, is a craftsman rather than a mere artist. With this, I have tried to summarize Sujit Mukherjee's notion of translation. My dear students, Mukherjee wanted to establish translation as new writing, I mean creative writing, translation as transcreation, translation as craft, translation as discovery and recovery, and finally, translation is not an isolated segment of artistic activity, but translation is multilingual and multicultural discourse. Thank you.